Once again, very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Darby. Today we're going to flip the coin, as it were, with the first installment of what I anticipate will be a recurring feature, focusing on the unsung heroes of golf facilities around the world, those women and men that arise at stupid o'clock to prepare the daily golfing test for the rest of us. Today we're going to take a look at greenkeeping and agronomy. I'm very grateful to friend of the pod, Richard Pennell, for joining us today. Richard is a man of many talents. Some of you might know him by his Twitter alter ego at Pitchmarks, which has taken the golf world by storm recently. If you haven't read any of his masterful pieces, please follow the link in the show notes to take a peek. I'm pretty certain that it will lead to clicking the subscribe button. Amongst other things, Richard is a qualified greenkeeper who turned to the dark side in becoming an assistant managing secretary and progressing to managing secretary at his most recent club. Richard has held these positions with distinction at a number of high-profile clubs in the greater London area. I can think of no one better to assist me today in shining a light on the dark arts of grass growing, agronomic planning, divot and pitchmark repair, the management of member expectations, the environment, sustainability and biodiversity, and that age-old question of whether you need to be certifiable to become a turf professional. Many thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoy. Richard, you're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm very grateful that you've spared us some time away from your hectic writing, golfing and shed tidying schedule. How is everything there in the London area?
All good. Thank you, Shane. Sun shining. I have a game of golf lined up for tomorrow morning. Things are looking up. The shed's a mess, but we'll come on to that, I'm sure.
Absolutely. An inveterate shed tidier. But, hey, you get to listen to your podcast that way.
That's it.
As you've said, you've been a very busy golfer of late with Pennell, Cleve Hill and Rye in the immediate rearview mirror. I assume you've got a few more rounds coming up.
Yes. So I'm playing speed golf in the morning at a place called The Springs. What else have I got? I've got a visit to Northamptonshire County next week. Painswick. I'm doing my best to tick off some of these places that have been bucket list items for years on end. Doing quite well with that at the moment. So where else have I played recently? Played the Berkshire Red this week. Just glorious golf out there, and it's a nice time of year over here. The grass is just waking up and the sun's shining. It's a bit warmer, not so frosty, so it's wonderful.
Spring is springing over here as well, so that's always great, and we're back off mats, shall we say? So that's always a positive.
Good.
Just something to say as a little thank you for today. Ryan Nodes from the Addington has invited me over to play there, and in advance of his appearance on the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast, would you like to join me in that particular adventure as and when I get across?
How wonderful. Yes. Regardless of the date, I'm there.
Excellent. Well, that is a date then. So, well, look, very grateful for you, as I said, for joining us, and grateful for the listeners to tune in. This little tossing the coin, as I said in the introduction, is trying to look at greenkeeping 101, if you like. So it might be useful to begin with a brief introduction to the history of greenkeeping, what happened before the notion of greenkeeping ever existed, how it all began and developed over time.
Okay. So, the keeper of the green was quite often a part-time or shared-time role at some of these clubs a century and more ago. You would have the club professional handling that role, and often a single individual, very much a manual process with tools that haven't been seen for many decades around here, the scythe and non-fueled push mowers. They also had a lot of grazing livestock. On certain courses retain that these days, but that was a big part of keeping the grass down and defining the course, if you like, because the livestock would keep to the short stuff. Very minimal inputs. Traditional greenkeeping favoured very low input of nitrogen and more making use of the qualities of the soil on those original golf courses. So you've got obviously links. It's extremely acidic soil, very little capacity to hold onto nutrient, and that suits fine grasses like bents and fescues that still prevail and outperform in those situations. Then it came inland, and you've got the heathland courses of Surrey and Berkshire, and the sand belt in Melbourne and so on. And then I think it's fair to say parkland courses, most of those came a bit later, and there are a bit more challenges in terms of greenkeeping there. And then over the years, exposure to golf, the number of people playing the game, all of those sort of things were developing all the time. Expectation of players from watching Augusta and so on, going up all the time, and we're still seeing that. And there's a very much a culture of keeping an eye on the club down the road and seeing what they're doing. And it's quite a competitive field, and booming golf clubs in the 80s and so on just exacerbated that. I think it's a pretty competitive market, and so these days modern club over here would have a top tier club would have anywhere between 8 and 15 green staff per 18 holes, with professional mechanics and probably someone handling HR and health and safety. It's become a pretty intensive thing, and with that the science behind it and the equipment that the guys and girls use has developed beyond measure, really. It's an interesting phase at the moment, moving towards more electrical powered kit and automation of things like irrigation systems. We'll probably come on to that. It's turned from the dark arts, if you like, into a sort of blend of art and science, and the modern course manager is a very specialized individual these days. So it's an interesting time, I think, for the whole industry, but particularly for the turfies out there.
Interesting that you mentioned the science part of it. I'm going to follow up that answer with perhaps a very philosophical question. Is greenkeeping a science or an art, or both? Perhaps we can look at that question through a time-based continuum.
Yes, I think it's very much a blend. So there's a spectrum. I think traditional greenkeeping was pretty simple in terms of the nutrients and applications that were available. You would typically not put down very much in terms of nitrogen. You might put down a bit of iron, a bit of potassium to strengthen the grasses at certain points, but it was more around drainage, and that's sort of the greenkeeper's motto is drainage is so important in terms of keeping the grass healthy, as dry as it can be, and encouraging root growth and so on, because the drier the soil is, the more your grass roots will probe down. That makes it stronger and more resistant to disease and stress, drought tolerance. So I think we started off in a fairly arty side of that spectrum, and as time has gone on, and as I said, expectations have moved forward, it's getting more and more scientific. The chemicals and other applications, fertilizers and so on, that they use these days are highly tested, highly refined, bespoke to certain sites, and the modern course manager is reliant on a whole load of different data, which is often recorded at the club. So rainfall and soil moisture probes and all that sort of thing, and that scientific approach, I think, is backed up in the education that these professionals go through these days. You don't get to be in charge of a course without a decent qualification, and all of this, the sciencey side of stuff, the data collection, the analysis of that data, it's all part of a bigger picture. So I think the industry is moving towards a far more professional, far more scientific craft, if you like, but they are also dealing with a living thing, basically an enormous site of living plants and the weather. And so you throw that in the mix, and there's still place for judgment there. There's no shortcut to experience, and I think the challenge for modern course managers is juggling those two things. I mean, we all know what it would look like in ideal circumstances, but how often do you have those? There's always something going on behind the scenes, like a cracked drainage pipe that you can't even see, or the irrigation fails overnight, or you just get continuous rain or drought. It goes either way. It's a juggling act, I think. I'm not sure I've answered that very well, Shane. I think it's a blend of the two. Can I get away with that?
I'll give you a pass. Okay.
Great. Okay.
We'll give you a B- on
Good
that.
start.
Okay? It's not a bad start. Not a bad start. As with any profession, Richard, budgeting and planning form an important part of a superintendent's recurring tasks. Perhaps you can outline how a typical annual agronomic plan might be agreed upon, how it might differ between seasons, and how new technology is assisting in improved understanding of staff contact hours on task-related activities.
Okay. Well, I'm only speaking from my limited experience, but in the clubs I've been at, the course manager is best placed to set out proposed budget for the year, and they're coming at it often with many years' experience. They will plan the peaks and troughs of certain bits of expenditure. So at the clubs I've been at, you typically have 2 maintenance seasons, or maintenance weeks, if you like. So it'd be sort of March or April, and then it tends to be August around here because quite a lot of the Londoners go away that time of year. So there'll be spikes in things like top dressing and granular nutrients, that sort of thing there. You tend to find material prices are creeping up year on year, so you'll try and build in some sort of fairly minimal increase there, but it's a cyclical job. You obviously get unexpected things happening, but in terms of capital projects and improvements and things like course furniture and pathworks and so on, most of the time that's planned well in advance, so you roll that into any budget. In terms of priorities, I think this is where it can be tricky for turf professionals, because you might have a site of 150 or 200 or more acres to look after of fine turf, and you can get 80% of it right and still struggle with golfer perception around the less important things. If you've got half decent tees and your fairways are okay, they're growing well, and the greens are good, and the greens are so important because that's what everyone remembers, you would put your priorities there initially in terms of daily maintenance of the green, be it cutting or rolling or spiking, and also your aeration program would focus on that area. And then depending on the club and the means and the style of presentation that they're looking for, you expand from that. You're dealing with the weather, and you're dealing with a large area. You will never have 100% perfect conditions throughout the place, but you do your best to prioritize the important things and let the rest look after itself as and when time permits.
Cool. Just in terms of, you mentioned briefly in not the immediate last answer, but the testing and the measuring. Obviously, as part of any planning cycle, my understanding is there's a lot more testing in terms of firmness, in terms of moisture levels, and feeding that back into the plan and adjusting as appropriate. What importance do those testing elements play in just a checks and balances in terms of a week-to-week or a month-to-month perspective on the plan itself?
Well, in my most recent experience of this, that I was working with a course manager who took a lot of data. So they were measuring clip rate every day, how much grass is coming off, and through that they could have a strong feel of the nutrient levels in the plant, and whether the I think later on we'll come on to plant growth regulators, whether the BGRs were growing out and needed adjusting or reapplying. They would also measure green speed on a variety of greens just to keep a feel on that. We started using soil moisture sensors in the actual soil, so that was an automated thing, sending a signal through to a sort of computerized weather system. Measure rainfall daily, wind speed as well, because that has an enormous effect on evapotranspiration and how much water and or nutrient you have to put back onto the plant. I think it's really, really important that, and it just is security, if you like, for a modern course manager to have that data, but it will also inform decisions. It's so it serves two purposes. It'll show that, you know, there's a reason why such and such green is struggling, because perhaps the soil moisture is higher in that area for some reason. It might be the soil type it's built on, or some sort of issue with the drainage. So it provides a backup there, but it will also it can show trends over time. Quite a lot of clubs use external agronomists who might come in for, you know, 1 or 2 or more visits a year, just do some further testing, things like Clegg hammers that measure surface firmness, and you would get cores done to measure thatch fairly regularly as well. Again, you can do that stuff internally if you like, but so I think it's a good example of where the science sort of backs up the art, because, you know, an experienced greenkeeper will walk across their 13th green and they'll know what they'll have a feel just from the actual feel of the green, what their thatch levels are like or how dry it is. You can tell when the grass is happy, and when in the summer perhaps you can see stress, you know, 50 feet away you can see where an area is stressed or perhaps suffering from drought or so on. But this data helps to back up the more experience-based decisions, I'd say.
I think maybe we might take a look at an introduction to grass, if that's not too much trouble. Quite a wide subject topic. I'm just minded, first of all, just say it's obviously a living organism that exhibits cyclical performance due to outside influences. I'm kind of thinking that those outside influences predominantly are weather related and traffic related. Perhaps we might look at irrigation first of all, and irrigation with sports turf. And is essentially green what we need or want? I mean, I have images of Tory pines from last year and sprinklers turned around into the rough, which I didn't feel was a great look. I do understand that Tory pines have a water recycling facility, so they're not essentially using mains water for that. But I guess maybe if we look at irrigation in terms of what it does, how it's best utilised, and whether or not green or indeed brown is what we're potentially maybe after.
Okay, well, there are so many different sites and so many different preferences for golfers and clubs and so on. So I come at this from I love the links and I love the sandy heathlands, and I don't think personally, it's just my opinion, other people like different types of golf, but I don't think golf comes any better than pretty dry, firm and fast, Shane, I should be saying at this point, shouldn't I?
You'll get no disagreement here. The name of the podcast tells you my preference.
I had a feeling where you were coming from. So I'm most familiar with the heathland. I think that those golf courses, if you are in tune with the architectural intention of many of the older ones, they were laid out to replicate as best you could the links conditions. This is way before, you know, any automatic irrigation was in place, and there's very few that don't have irrigation through the fairways, and a few of the ones who've managed to get by with that. It so far are going down that road in just at the moment. Actually, there's a couple around here that are doing it, having never had it before. And that's just a reaction to more extremes of climate, I think, and a couple of very dry years. I was greenkeeping in 2006 at Mitcham Golf Club, southwest London, and we had not a drop of rain for, I can't remember how many weeks it was. It's like 12 weeks in a row without any rain. And we had green teas and green greens, and everything else was dormant. But the interesting point was that the following year, the predominantly bent and fescue fairways there, and that they've stayed bent and fescue partly because they've never had fairy irrigation. They were as strong as they'd ever been, because up to the point where the grass lay dormant, it looks dead, but it wasn't. Those grass roots had just been probing and probing for moisture and nutrients in the soil. It was noticeable when we took calls the following year how deep the roots had gone. So there are arguments on both sides, and if you were setting up a new golf course in in sandy soil, perhaps you can get away with it. But in the odd year when there's no rain at all, the clubs will feel exposed, I would think, if they don't have irrigation. But you ask me whether green or brown, I think the purpose of a well-designed irrigation system, and one where the configuration and the sprinkler positioning has been put in so you can cover accurately the grass and not the heather or the rough or the other bits that you shouldn't be watering environmentally as well as from the playing sort of standpoint. Putting in a proper system that can control the output of water enables you to dry the course out, which I think some golfers have trouble getting their head around that. But if you've got a modern system with good data coming through and accurate control of each head and so on, you can water it just as much as it needs. And the modern weather station will tell you exactly how much moisture is disappearing, being wicked away by the wind, or just from the temperature. The evapotranspiration rate is there every morning on your device, and you can put back whatever percentage you want of that to slowly dry the course out. So that's it's an ongoing process, and the weather plays into that one as well, of course. And ideally we'd irrigate less, but you've got to have the turf healthy and alive before you can start to dry out a course that's been overwatered perhaps over the years.
Training the grass, and I'm minded that you mentioned bent and fescue fairways, probing in terms of looking for water. I'm wondering if it's possible to train grass to use less water.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think encouraging root depth will help. I don't know if that's training it to use less water. It's probably helping you need to irrigate less, because the deeper the roots go, the more they're going to be able to cope with, seasonal droughts and so on. Certain grasses are thirstier and hungrier than others, and bent and fescue are the predominant grass species in links for a good reason. They will outperform in dry, hungry conditions. When you start to put on more water and more feed and so on, you get the likes of peranua and so on coming in. I'm not saying one's good or the other. I'm not nowhere near fundamentalist on grass species, but and again, technology is playing a role there. So you get some people who are absolutely adamant that bent and fescue is the only way for the traditional golf course, and other people are using very advanced dwarf leafed ryegrass, for example, to good effect. And I think you have to be realistic and realize that people are playing more golf than they did 50 years ago, or whenever Jim Arthur was talking about fine greenkeeping. I'm not saying he was wrong. It was perfect for the time, but there are circumstances where a broader view might help. And when you've got people playing through the winter as they do and putting 30, 40, 50,000 rounds through golf courses, it's that's a different challenge. So you might need a hardier grass in certain high traffic areas to cope with that. I'm not sure I've answered your question there, Shane. But...
Let's move on.
Thank you. You can tell I'm sweating.
Yeah, I'll get you out of the corner. Okay, no problem. Maybe we look at disease for a second. I certainly understand that this past winter, and again, it's probably an exemplar of the last few winters in Ireland and the UK, warmer than usual, less frost, probably more moisture in the air. My understanding is that those conditions, particularly obviously with increased traffic as well, because I know many of our courses were inundated, particularly the free draining type, were inundated with member play and visitor play, etc., etc. My understanding is that weather conditions of that nature are just in the sweet spot for the fungal disease like brown patch, dollar spot, and fusarium. Am I correct in this assumption?
Yeah, I think so. The absence of hard frost is an interesting one. Frost is, it is pretty brutal on all of the plants if you get a series of hard frost. But actually, from a greenkeeping perspective, as long as you haven't got very heavy traffic, which the traffic has increased through the winter, but there's not that many lunatics going out when it's -2. Dew is a significant challenge, I think, and there are products you can use to reduce dew sitting on the grass leaf, but you just get that sort of heavy early morning dew and the temperatures rising. It's ideal, an ideal situation for things like fusarium to take hold, and they tend to spread very fast. Lots of these diseases they're in the plant, they're in the soil anyway. It's just that they under those conditions, if it's damp and a bit warmer than usual for that time of year, they will tend to spread quickly. Grass species again, I think, plays a role there. You would be hopeful that the more traditional species are a bit hardier against that. The cleanness of the cut, if you're going out there with semi-sharp cylinder blades and tearing the leaf blade, it's a bit like a cut on your finger. If you get a paper cut, not that many people use paper anymore, but if you get a paper cut, it tends to be a very clean cut, and you stick a plaster on and it's it mends very well. But if you get a jagged cut off something, it takes a bit more work for that wound to heal. And I think having good sharp cutting equipment certainly helps reduce disease prevalence. And then the chemical applications. So there's a few parts of that. So diseases will get used to being sprayed with certain chemicals. You can knock fusarium on the head, for example, with an application, but I think what we're seeing more and more clubs do, and it makes sense from an environmental standpoint as well as financial, is spot spray. So try and keep a closer eye on outbreaks of disease, because you'll often get it on 1 or 2 greens where they get hammered, and then golfers are walking on those, so they'll transmit spores onto other greens that are less affected by it. But if you can get to it early and spot spray, you're not using much chemical, and you're catching it earlier, if you like. But it's a tricky one, because no golfer likes seeing a green that's got fusarium scars all over it. But some of the traditional stuff that greenkeeping has entailed, in the decades before, lots of top dressing, lots of root development work through aeration, and overseeding with Benson fescues, all of that is part of the picture that makes it better. I think we're probably heading towards a situation where you can't spray for that stuff. And I know that's been the case in Germany for, I don't know, probably 10 years. It might even be more than that. Environmentally, we're going to have to sharpen up those few remaining elements of course maintenance that aren't ideal. I think we'll have more and more products taken away from us. And that's, in my opinion, a good thing. But the golfer needs to understand why the golf course might not necessarily be quite as good as they remember it.
My understanding is it's the same story in the Netherlands. They have very few products they can still use of a chemical nature. And a nice little segue into the mention of coring and verti draining, etc., etc. Obviously, part of the requirement for any plant is that they are able to breathe. And obviously with traffic and more traffic across the putting surfaces, obviously that leads to compaction, and I guess periodic coring or verti draining is important to just open up those pores and let the plant breathe again. Also looking at removing thatch in terms of that build-up of organic matter in the root zone. Just interested to look at, I guess, the traditional verti draining versus two new ideas which I've seen as Air2G2 and Dryject, and obviously then that plays into top dressing and overseeding, which would be the follow-up application for verti draining. So maybe you might just confirm that I have the rationale with regard to verti draining and coring correct, first of all. How often should it happen every year? And I know it's a pain in the ass for golfers, but it really, I guess it's either that or the non-disturbance approach, which we might look at it as well, where there's none of that going on. And why would one, and why do superintendents and greenkeeping teams undertake that particular work, if you like, on a yearly basis?
Okay, so the key reason to carry out aeration on your playing surfaces is to remove a degree of the thatch. So the thatch is just dead plant matter. It sits at the right up near the top of the profile, and you want some thatch there because it's protecting the plant. It's sort of a cushion. It's providing, as it decomposes, it's probably providing a little bit of nutrient there. You want a percentage of thatch, and I know of someone who was so aggressive with thatch removal that he got it down to 2% at a particular club, and actually the greens were too firm and the grass was starting to struggle a bit, so they had to ease off that. But you're testing my memory a bit here, Shane. I think generally the STRI, Sports Turf Research Institute, would say on most sites you're looking for about 4% thatch. And if you don't aerate, it's going to go above that, and you end up with playing surfaces where the ball's not running. You can't run the ball in as well. It's pitching very hard, perhaps in wet times. That you'll end up with plugged lies and that sort of thing. So thatch removal is a big part of it. Then you're also typically injecting or brushing in top dressing into any holes you make. So verti draining is a solid hole. Coring is sort of a cylinder and it pulls out plugs. You quite often see those around. And then you'll top dress behind with sand, normally with some sort of natural additive in that's just going to provide a bit more nutrient and balance to the soil. And it depends how scientific a site you're on and how, on the budget and so on, that sort of thing can get very technical. You're ideally looking to punch holes so that you get grass roots going to varying depths. You wouldn't say the deeper the better. I think what's really important is you have a variety of depths. So if you were to hollow core to 8 inches year after year after year, you're going to have good root growth for those 8 inches because it's very easy for the grass roots to get through the sand or top dressing down to that level, and you'll end up sooner or later with a pan at that level where the grass can't go any further. The moisture that should percolate through the soil can't go beyond that. So you need a balance, and that's why I think at most clubs you'll see a variety of approaches. So they'll do some little and often microtines, which most of the time, if that's done well, you can play the next morning and not even know it's been done. That's a good way of getting some air into the soil. Sorry, one other thing I should say. Another massive benefit of putting holes in the soil is you are releasing gases, because you can have lots of gas build up in the soil, which is going to be effectively poisonous to the grass roots, and just not part of a pleasant growing environment. Air to G2 and dry eject, I haven't had too much experiences there. I've seen the air to G2 work, and it's very effective. It's blasting high pressure air into the root zone, and that's good. I mean, that's going to help the plant be vibrant and healthy, having that in the root zone, particularly in sites where you get a lot of traffic, and therefore you've got a bit more compaction. Lots of clubs are cutting or rolling their greens every single day through the season, and that's a lot of weight, a lot of natural compaction happening there. I think you have to be a bit careful with those tools and not overuse them. If you use them too often, there's probably a risk, depending on your subsoil, of making the ground unstable. Such a variety of, you get push-up greens with just old soil, and they've made them into upturned saucers, basically 150 years ago, to collect water. That's a very different environment to maintain than a USG specification sand root zone. So you tailor the approach to the ground you're working with, I think. But the other one that's quite interesting, and in terms of removing thatch, your superintendent and course manager will know what percentage of thatch you'd remove at a certain height with a certain width of hollow core, say. The Graydon tool that you see used quite a lot can be used, and it's very aggressive, and it takes out, depending again on spacings of the blades, but it can take out an enormous amount of thatch in 1 or 2 passes. You have to be really careful with that too, because if you carry on using the Graydon year after year, crisscrossing the lines, you'll end up weakening the turf on top, because you're sort of cutting across at crisscrossing the lines. You can weaken the turf that way. So it needs a sort of balanced approach. Shane, I'm sorry, I'm rambling there a bit. I could probably go on for 2 or 3 days on aeration.
That's the whole idea, mate.
But it's St. Patrick's Day.
You weren't meant to mention that, but anyway, I've been sworn to not mentioning dates on this bloody show.
Oh, okay.
It basically means I'll have to edit it out. Anyway, I'm only joking. Look, that was a very fine answer. I asked you a lot of questions together there, so you were answering a number of questions together. So I'm happy days with that. It may be, in terms of just looking very briefly at the non-disturbance approach, I know some superintendents adopt the non-hollow coring, just let it be idea. Why would one do that instead of doing what the rest of the industry are doing?
I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer this, but I'm intrigued by it, because I'd like to know more about how that works in practice and what sites it's being deployed at. Because if you've got anything like the traffic that a typical commercial golf club has these days, I find it tricky to understand how you avoid compaction, even on sandy sites. I think you would need to be pretty creative in directing traffic. But again, I mean, clearly for you to ask a question, clearly people are doing this, and they would know better than I do why they're doing it. So, I think I need to go and do some more research on that.
That's phone a friend territory, so that's all right.
Yeah.
No problem. Maybe getting back to wetting agent and PGRs, when might one use a wetting agent and a PGR, and what do those things do from a grass perspective?
Okay, so I'll start with PGRs. I've seen these used very
That's
effectively.
plant growth regulator, yeah?
Yes, so it's something you'd spray on a fairly regular basis on, well, predominantly greens, but I've seen it used on other playing surfaces as well. PGRs will limit the upwards growth of the plant. So when you're going out mowing, and lots of clubs these days are removing clippings, nearly always do that on the greens, nearly always on the tees, but lots of clubs are moving to do that on fairways, which is a pain in the backside for the green staff because they're emptying the cages of grass every 4 seconds. But using PGRs will reduce that amount of cost and time associated with grass clippings. But what it also does is it stimulates lateral growth. So the grass plant and roots will tend to grow sideways more than they would ordinarily. And that's very useful for things like divot repair. It thickens the sward. Anything you do to thicken the sward is going to help protect a certain area against traffic. And it's not just foot traffic or trolleys or buggies. You also get ride-on mowers that are cutting most playing surfaces. They're heavy things, so you get certain areas, pinch points, where either it's the desire line of the golfer or it's where the mowers have to turn. It's quite a lot of stress you're putting on that particular area. The stronger you can make the sward, and PGRs help with that, the better. And wetting agents an interesting one. So they're quite delicate things, grass plants. So I've seen situations where you get hydrophobic soil where you can go out and hand water certain areas, and the plant just can't effectively take up the hand watering.
Which we would have had during the drought of 2018 at some point in some courses.
Yeah, lots of it. And it's sort of a chemical reaction that means that you could water overnight, all night, a certain area, and if it's hydrophobic soil, you're not going to get the penetration. The plant's not going to be able to access the moisture there, which over time just gets worse and worse. And you tend to find that happens on particularly high spots. So you might have a sort of south-facing lump in a green or a surround where it's cut fairly short, so it's under a fair amount of stress as it is, and then the sun's just beating down on it, and because it's slightly proud or hydrophobic, has grown hydrophobic for some other reason, you just can't keep it wet. And that's where wetting agents are particularly valuable. But they're also used to enable you to irrigate less, which, if you've got a limit of irrigation water. So again, 2018, I mean, there were plenty of clubs where they either didn't have reservoirs or boreholes and were reliant on mains water that could be removed at any moment, or they had a financial imperative to minimize how much water they were putting in, or they didn't have access to water, and it has gone away in the past. I mentioned 2006, which was the very dry year I was greenkeeping. Walton Heath round the corner from me, they were tankering in grey water to irrigate their tees and greens on those two golf courses because they were cut off. They got cut off by the council to mains water. So you'll see there's a lot of clubs at the moment thinking very seriously about getting rid of that reliance on mains water, because sooner or later they'll get taken away when you most need it. So wetting agents are an important part of the planning, I would say, for a modern greenkeeper.
Am I correct in saying that in order to activate the wetting agent, obviously it's applied, and then you need to apply water on top of the solution to activate it?
Oh, you've got me there, Shane. I'm pretty sure you're right there. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, and quite a lot of these things, not just wetting agent, but PGRs and foliar and granular feeds, you would normally wash these things in. There are certain products where you don't want to wash them in too hard because you'll wash away the effect. So you wouldn't spray fusarium and wash that in too thoroughly. Otherwise, you're just soaking the chemical right through into the root zone beyond the plant. But yeah, I think you're right with wetting agent, and the plant will be better able to absorb the moisture as a result of that.
A related topic with regard to grass growing is, of course, trees and their usefulness or otherwise to that whole growing process. I have here written the definitive commentary on trees and grass growing. I doubt we'll be able to explore all of it, but I'm just wondering, in terms of grass growing and trees, what considerations should we think about with regard to grass growing when trees are about?
Okay. If I was going to phone a friend for this question, it would be Clayton, as you well know. So, but
we both know what he thinks about trees. But he actually, to be fair, he gets a bad rap on that. You need to understand his thoughts with regard to trees in relation to Australia and the beautification committees, etc., and essentially moving non-indigenous to the area trees from Perth to Melbourne, which ultimately, if you feed back into wanting to play in a natural surrounds from a golfing perspective, if you have the right trees in the right place, which are indigenous to the area, then that's surely to be welcomed, as opposed to just an over-treeing of everything.
Yeah. Thank you, Shane. That's I didn't know some of the detail there. I just sort of was speaking through ignorance there, but I know.
You could just call him Chainsaw Mike alternatively.
Okay, so it's an interesting one, trees. It's a very emotive topic at many golf clubs, and I think most people understand the ecological value of trees. And, for example, talking about indigenous species, if you've got, what is it, Quercus rhobarb, the English oak on an English golf course, a mature oak will support an enormous variety of biodiversity. But if you've got that tree in a position where it's prominent to the golf course, and that'll happen because these things tend to grow, it'll become more and more a part of how you play the hole, and might impede either the health of the turf or the strategy of the golf course in the first place. And I think it's fair to say most golf courses have a pretty wide area which isn't actual playing corridor, and there's plenty of scope for those two things to exist side by side. I tend to get a bit touchy on this because I love the heathlands, and heathland is it's in the global biodiversity action plan in terms of ecology and environmental sustainability. It's one of the most important habitats there is, way beyond the trees that surround it and actually impede it. So if you've got a deciduous tree like an oak in an area where you've got some of the remaining, whatever it is, 10%, I think they say 90% of the heathland in the UK and globally has been lost in the last couple of 100 years. And around the corner from me in Wisley, they built a motorway and just decimated an enormous patch of it, which is fine. We need wheel drive cars and we need to get from A to B, but golf courses provide valuable wildlife corridors, and they're by and large sustainably maintained. I think I can say that without getting absolutely slaughtered. So if you can manage the trees sensibly, you can still have them at the golf course and enjoy their beauty and everything else they add to the the environment without what's the right word, without affecting the golf itself negatively. Because if you've got a golf course there, we're custodians of a patch of land for however long golf lasts. I get that, but golf is providing exercise and mental health benefits and enjoyment and jobs for various people and so on. If it's a golf course and you've got a tree where it's affecting how you play the golf course, then you might have a difficult decision to make. I think I read somewhere that the foliage of the average golf course property, it grows 3% a year. So, you factor in compound interest. And if you don't do anything, don't take any trees out for a few years, you've suddenly got a much harsher reality of having to do it on a large scale. And you see there's lots of examples of that around here where they're being what looks fairly aggressive, but it's just catching up really. I should talk about the effect of trees. So if you had a deciduous oak over some heathland, you'll typically find a circle of just soil beneath the tree where the nutrient of the leaf litter has just smothered the heather. The heather can't grow there. It's being smothered. The nutrient of the leaf is slowly decomposing and enriching the soil, and heather outcompetes grass and other things in very, very poor soil. You've also got safety issues. It's quite labor intensive to be going around your site the whole time looking at the older trees and checking for limbs that might be suffering. We had a few down in the wind in the local area, I know, which took some clearing up. But then the other important thing, I think, is you can have trees adjacent to the playing surface, the main playing surfaces, where you think they might not impede. But if you go out there on a late afternoon in summer and you look at the shade, as you know, I'm pretty familiar with Woking. There's a whole load of oak trees that used to sit among the pines on the left of the Forth. Classic hole as far as golf architecture goes, with two central bunkers, and the left-hand side of that hole, when Lowe and Patton went out there and dug those principals' nose.
That's the hole that started strategic golf design.
Yeah, it's the one. Yeah, Lowe and Patton went out there in apparently a rainy morning in January or something 100 years ago, and started digging in the middle of so it's a tribute to the principal's nose up in St Andrews. And Simpson, who was a member there and about to qualify for the bar, I think, he went out there and looked at it, and his whole life course, the story goes, changed as a result of looking at that and realizing there's more to this than just penal architecture. There's
apologies for that tangential question.
No, I'm glad you mentioned it, actually. But that hole, I mean, it's an incredible piece of design, that, and Simpson's drawings of it are just gorgeous. But it had heather all the way up the left-hand side in the old days. And so you had a decision to make. You lay up short and leave yourself a longer shot into a green that sloped away, or you take on the bunkers and try and thread it through the bunkers and the railway line, which remains terrifying to this day. Goodness knows what it was like for those guys with hickory. But sorry, I'm drifting off. On the left there was a lot of oak in that corridor. 2 years ago, the oaks came out, leaving the pines, which have a lot less cast a lot less shade, and that fairway is just transformed. It's the lowest spot on Woking's golf course, I think, possibly the sixth is lower, but it's the light comes through, that you feel the air move through that area, you feel the wind on the second shot, and there's a lot less maintenance has to go into keeping that fairway and green dry and decent as a result of that. And it's just, you'd think those were well out of the way, but it depends on the direction of the hole and where the sun's sitting and so on. It's a complex topic, trees and grass growing.
In many ways, the trees and the grass are in competition from a growing perspective.
Yes, yeah. And you'll hear people say in defense of trees, like, I love trees, and particularly, gorgeous old oaks, and it takes a long time to replant something and let it grow to the point where it's as valuable ecologically as a mature oak. but you hear people say, well, the tree roots are taking away moisture in the winter. No, that's not true, because they're not growing. So the tree roots are stealing moisture and nutrient from the grass when they need it most in the summer season, when everything's growing and they're in leaf and so on. So it's they're in direct competition in lots of situations. It's interesting how many clubs have large trees as their logos. Actually, that's quite.
Formby comes to mind.
I didn't know that. I've not been there. My favorite
pine
one.
trees.
Oh right. Okay. Yeah, so it's a difficult one. The only other thing I'd say about that is you can see. I saw an oak the other day. I won't say where it is, but it's quite near a green, and they say the root structure of an oak tree will expand as wide as the tree is tall, and you've got this just enormous tree. It's about 5 paces off the back right of a heath and golf hole, and you look at the green, you can see that's not in the same condition as the previous 6 or whatever it was.
Interesting. Perhaps we might move on to a subject matter that's often quite near to greens, bunkers. And I'm interested to get a greenkeeping idea in relation to this. And I'm going to start with a crude analogy in terms of consistency of bunkers. It's a bit like a dog chasing a car looking for consistency in bunkers, obviously due to the aspect, the direction, the moisture levels, shade, wind effect, sun, traffic, etc., etc. I'd just like to look at bunkering and bunker maintenance in terms of chasing that consistency and how that actually feeds into man hours, expense, and potentially percentage of time for the green staff.
It's an interesting one. This in the UK, this is changing at the moment. There's quite a lot of clubs have gone through trials and then big expensive projects with bunker liners. So there's various types of lining you can use for bunkers. I think the end point is they're looking for the consistency that the modern golfer seems to want in bunkers. So you want something where the liner beneath the sand will drain freely, so that you can have heavy rain overnight, or it might be catching the corner of an irrigation cycle, and you don't hit your ball in there and find it's in a puddle of water, or worse still, the bunker's completely full of water because it's been raining for a week. So you want something that's free draining, and there's various products they're using now. It's sort of along the lines of tarmac, or there's a couple of different ones actually. I'm not going to mention product names, but
porous concrete and that sort of stuff.
Yes, yeah, and they're pretty expensive. I think about right. Yeah, it might have changed recently actually with material costs, but I think you're talking about $5,000 a bunker to stick that stuff in. But the benefit is they will drain freely. You install a sump or a soak away drain underneath it. You put this layer on, and in theory you put a load of sand in there, whack a plate it down so it's nice and firm, and then rake it every day. And you're just moving the sand around for the remainder of the season. A bit comes out with the ball now and then. A bit comes out on the lady's shoe as she exits the bunker or whatever. But generally, you can be pretty sure that nothing's coming through from the soil. So you haven't got stones in the bunker, which, God forbid they damage the soul of our shiny sand iron. And the bunker. I've got a story about that I probably shouldn't tell, actually. So,
go on.
No, I'll tell you after. It's classic. Remind me. So you want it to drain. You know, I'm nothing if not a coward. You want it to drain. You don't want stones coming through from the soil underneath, and you just want, or the golfer seems to want, a very consistent lie in the bunker. So if you commit to that expenditure, $5,000 a bunker, it depends how many bunkers you've got. There's plenty of courses around here with fairly minimal bunkers. New Zealand down the road, I can't remember what they've got. I think it might be something like 40. It's quite a low number for 18 holes, but they're brilliant. Simpson put them there. He's put them in the right places. They affect, they challenge the hard player and give a corridor for the the high handicap player to get past them. If you think about putting those in a course with 100 or so bunkers, it's a pretty punchy amount of money, and you don't actually know at this point how long those things last because they're fairly new technology. But if you do that, I guess you will spend less time installing drains in the winter in the ones that just cannot seem to get the water away, or topping up the sand every time because it's being contaminated with soil, or replacing all of the sand because the contamination is so strong that you've got lumps of soil and stones in there. And raking, most clubs tend to rake their bunkers, I think 7 days a week generally. I come at this from a more, we're getting to know each other, Shane. I think it won't surprise you, I come at this a more rustic viewpoint. I love Royal Ashdown Forest, got no bunkers there, but there's plenty of imagination used around the greens where you don't need them. Swinley Forest, just the most incredible golf course. There are bunkers at Swinley, but a bit like New Zealand, there aren't that many, and they make fabulous use of these sort of little grassy, heathy runoffs around the green, and little hollows where you get a far more challenging shot if you're sat in there, or if you're on the short grass runoffs on one side of the green than you do in the bunker. And I grew up playing on a pitch and putt where no one ever raked the bunkers, and back in those days, it doesn't apply now, but I could get out the bunker and they were a hazard. You just don't go in there. If you don't like the lie, don't go in there. So I'm not your average golfer. I appreciate that, but I generally think if people are moaning about the consistency of the bunkers, it's probably a good sign that the rest of your playing corridors, the non-hazard part of the golf course, is in fairly good shape, if they're starting to moan about that. And they could always go and have a lesson.
Well, that's back to your grip and being able to promote the bounce properly, isn't it?
Yeah.
Perhaps we can move on to tees very quickly, Richard, if you wouldn't mind. I'm interested to know and to understand how big of a task is it to re-level tees in terms of, obviously, over time with top dressing and divot repair and indeed compaction, I suppose. What once was level may turn into something that isn't level. I'm just wondering how big of a task. Obviously, it's dependent on the size of the tee box, but is it realistic to want billiard flat tee boxes at all times?
Well, again, there's a cost there. So I think we built some very small 8 meters by 6 ladies tees at Woking, and I think the cost of those was somewhere, including root zone and a bit of irrigation and so on, and some labour for a contractor to do it. I think it was roughly the same sort of figure as a bunker would cost. But you can do that sort of thing in-house if you've got the, perhaps not laser levelling, but you can get pretty good tee surfaces in-house by stripping the turf off. You might rotivate and then compact the subsoil and stick grass seed on top. That's the cheapest way to do it. It's not a huge operation, but the tee will be out of use for several weeks. It's an interesting one, that you do notice if you go onto one that's badly in need of renovation, if you like, and you just cannot get a decent lie on it, or the grass is really struggling through whatever it is, compaction or shade or whatever. I think it really depends on the club. I mean, in some respects, it's the place where it matters least what your lie is like. As long as you can stand in something resembling a flat lie, your ball's on the tee anyway. So, but I appreciate that it looks lovely if you've got nice square tees and they're mown nicely.
I think it's probably related to your previous answer with regard to bunkers. If people are giving out about the tees, the rest of your surfaces are probably pretty good.
Yeah. And again, no one who's getting up and down out of the bunker every time is whinging about them. So it might be that they just keep hitting the ball left off the tee, but I don't know. One thing I do really like, and I think there's been a little bit of a resurgence in it, is I've seen it in a couple of places around here where they're the sort of runoffs that surrounded the greens. They're gradually extending runoffs, and they'll just mow those straight into the next tee. And I just love that flow. I think probably in the old days, a lot more courses had that flow, albeit the turf may not have been quite as pristine as it is. But I do like that, where you don't really have demarcation between one and the other. You're just moving from the green straight onto the next tee, and it's all one lovely flow.
Yeah, I'm minded just to revisit our previous podcast with Frank Casey Jr. from Pennell, and their new golf course up in the St. Patrick's Links, obviously a Tom Doak creation. There's 3 or 4 scenarios where that short turf runs straight from the green onto the tee, which is a free-form tee. It's just, the flow, as you say, is just absolutely phenomenal.
I love that. We could do more of that.
Absolutely. And the march of distance, unfortunately, has brought us to 50, 60-yard walks backwards, as we will see at the Old Course for the next Open Championship, with 4 or 5 tees off the bloody golf course. But anyway, that's another story, and thankfully the USGA and the RNA seem to have launched or released something there yesterday which may address that, a spinnier ball and a smaller face, let's hope.
Shane, you've put a date on the podcast again, eh?
I know. Anyway, sorry, Wallace, if you're listening. Anyway, just one more question with regard to tees, and particularly the actual tee that you tee your ball up on. What, if anything, do broken tees do to rotary cutting blades?
Yeah, they're a pain. Yeah, they seem to be, despite breaking often enough that you have to go and buy some more every 3 visits to the golf club. They are quite firm, the typical tee. The plastic ones hardly ever break, but we shouldn't be using plastic. The wooden ones, you leave those stumps around, and the cylinder blades, they're spinning so fast, it's pretty rare that something like that would stop the blade spinning. But when that does happen, you'll quite often have a hydraulic leak, and one of those horrible stains up and down the tee, where hydraulic fluids burn the turf. But there's no question it dampens the sharpness of the cylinder and the bottom blade. And if you can keep those 2 surfaces nice and sharp, which most clubs with grinding units in-house and a mechanic will do, it's so beneficial for the presentation. Just the look and the health of the turf goes back to the disease tolerance thing I was rambling on about earlier. So lots of clubs have little buckets or cones where you're meant to stick your wooden tees. If there's one thing that drives me potty, it's people just leaving that stuff lying around. I mean, it's the most gorgeous environment to be in, a golf course, and we're so lucky. We're the 1% of the 1% who get to go out and have leisure time on these fabulous works of art, basically growing pieces of art. People leave their tees around, or their Mars bar wrappers, or the Pro V1 wrapper in the heather. It's just tidy up behind yourselves, guys. It's not good with the machinery, but also it's just, you don't need to do that. I'm forever wandering around picking up litter at the moment when I'm playing. But
meet your pal. I think in many ways, and it's a nice little sachet into what perhaps a golfer can do to help his local greenkeeping team out in terms of many hands making light work. I'm kind of minded to use another analogy, particularly with regard to pitch marks and indeed maybe the littering issue on golf courses as well. It reminds me of the person that doesn't drop their shopping trolley back to the trolley collection position in the car park in the supermarket. But I'm just wondering if if we can take a look at pitch marks and divot repair and traffic management and raking of bunkers, and how if we were all a bit more aware and respectful and less consumptive in terms of our on-course attitude, perhaps. And maybe this is just all down to a lack of awareness, but I certainly, and particularly during the winter when you're out and about and the greens perhaps aren't quite as firm as they are during the summer, that pitch mark repair becomes even more important, because any shot coming in from height, and I do appreciate that golfers may not be aware that because they're not on the green, they may not understand that they've actually left a pitch mark. But the awareness of same and how really we can all do our little bit in terms of pitch marks and divots and whatever else to really make the life of the greenkeeper that little bit easier, and actually that they can focus their time on value add as opposed to cleaning up after the golfer.
Yeah, one of the most visual things that I've seen done at a couple of places is where the greenkeeper will go out in the morning and put a ball on every unrepaired pitch mark on a green. I've seen one where, and I won't say where it was, but there were 30 unrepaired pitch marks on a green, and in fairly firm conditions. And sometimes you can't always see where your ball's landed from where you hit it, and sometimes you can't see the pitch mark itself. And I've played it, there've been rounds I've played at places like Deal and Rye where you're not making a pitch mark really. You have to really struggle to see any sort of sign that your ball landed on the green. Maybe it didn't, but I just, it's like the Pro V1 wrapper in the heather. I can't walk past those things. It takes 2 seconds to repair them. And if you think every golf course is going to have greenkeepers who will walk around the green and repair every pitch mark that golfers failed to see or just couldn't be bothered to repair before cutting the green, time doesn't exist for that. They'll probably repair the ones they walk directly past. Some greenkeepers would do them all, but they'll be out there all day preparing the golf course if they do that. So what happens is you run the mower over it, or you run the roller over, and over time, those indentations, they're just kicking our own balls offline. So the next time one of your putts bobbles, that it might not be your pitch mark, but it's someone else's, and it's one that's just not been repaired. And until the next time you do maintenance and stick down some more top dressing on that surface, it's likely that imperfection will remain there. If you get there quickly and repair it properly, and there's videos on YouTube and so on of how to do that. There's a good Golf Monthly one. I think it's Ben from West Hills showing, I think they did it for their members mainly, but it went out in Golf Monthly, just how to repair it properly. And it's amazing how many golfers don't get how to do that. But divots, again, just put them back quickly. They've got a chance of the cut root regenerating if you get it back there quickly. And when you put it back, step on it, because that keeps it in place. It gives it more chance of the roots regenerating, but also it makes it harder for crows to pick them up when they're looking for leather jackets. And it's rule 1.2 of the rules of golf, isn't it? And it's about as far as I get in the rules of golf when I attempt to read the thing, but it's the most important bit. It's care of the course, looking after each other. Sorry, Shane, I'm going to rant and rave about this, but I just find it, I can't imagine how frustrating it is for greenkeepers some days to go out there and look at their course that they're putting their heart and soul into preparing, and people can't be bothered to do the basic stuff. It's, enough said.
I think it can be encapsulated in one word, and it's probably respect for the course, for the staff, and for the fellow golfer.
Yeah, that's it. Absolutely.
Not wanting to be too hard on people, but I just wonder if ignorance is a defense.
Yeah. I wrote about this recently, and I can still remember standing in front of the clubhouse at the club I joined as a junior golfer and being sort of drilled by the professional. He was a lovely guy, but he left me in no uncertain terms the knowledge that I was going to replace my replace my divots, and I was going to repair my pitch marks. And I think he put the fear of God into me, I think so. But, that's just, we're all different, I guess. But it would make a huge difference, the morale of your green staff at your local club, I think, if they could see the members making an effort to do that stuff. And like you say, education is part of it. So if you're new to the game, that chat I had with the briefing I had from the professional when I was a junior, it's never left me that. So maybe we can do a better job of communicating that. There's a couple of other bits that are less obvious. I know you were keen to touch on pinch points and wear lines, and this time of year over here we have directive ropes and so on to protect certain areas. And ideally you get those moved fairly regularly, because every golfer will just take the desired line, and if you can just think about where you're walking for a minute, you can avoid contributing to the compaction. I'm a carrier. I never use a trolley or anything anywhere, and I appreciate some people need to and some people need buggies, but just be thoughtful about where you go. Don't go trampling through the heather or walking right on the edge of the green if you don't need to, because it's not helping.
Yeah, finally, just on that particular topic, bunkers and the right raking technique, or perhaps even maybe the right bunker rake. I've recently seen, I'm not sure if you're aware of the bunker wizard rake, which is almost like a whisk, if you can imagine. So it's actually virtually impossible to rake a bunker incorrectly with this kind of scenario. It's kind of a rotary whisk. So you just move the rake through the whisk, if you like, through the sand, and it whisks up the sand. It's probably one of the most simple and astonishing things I've ever seen.
And I've not seen that, so I'm woefully ignorant, but I will be Google searching it shortly after we finish. That sounds wonderful.
Just to be clear, it's called the bunker wizard rake.
Okay.
It's probably not quite as spectacular as the sweeping brushes that you get at Ballybunion. Quite literally, a big sweeping brush and a little sweeping brush, depending on how much sweeping you have to do of the sand. That's interesting as well. But I guess really my point being for anyone there is rake back into the bunker, keep the handle low, and leave it the way you found it. Or actually, no, don't leave it the way you found it. Leave it the way you'd like to find it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think education there is important as well. So, if your course manager were to take a group of members out and just on a course walk, why not just stop in a bunker or two and just show them how you prepare that bunker in the morning, and what happens over the course of a day's golf in terms of the members either not raking or, just show the process and the mindset around how you rake a bunker first thing in the morning.
Yeah, maybe we can move on to irrigation, Richard. I'm interested to speak about water sources and sustainability, the life cycle of irrigation systems, and perhaps maybe starting off with the historical evolution of irrigation. Obviously, maybe first of all, when a water source wasn't available, we're talking about ponds in the general vicinity of maybe a green or two. Obviously, then moving into single row irrigation, and then double row, and on to demand led and I guess electronically moderated irrigation.
Okay. Again, going back to Woking, it's quite a good example of some of this stuff. That golf course opened in 1893, I think I'm right in saying. And there are a number of seasonal ponds on the site where they used to, in very dry times, go over there with buckets and pull out the water and sort of gently pass it across the green. They then had a tees and greens irrigation system for many years, probably about 30 years, I think, but didn't irrigate the fairways for a long time. And so that discussion about 15 years ago of whether it was time to look at fairway irrigation was an emotive one, I gather. And, and I understand both sides. It's got a lot of money to spend, and are you going to diminish the heathland characteristics of the golf course? But they eventually put in a system there, and then a couple of years ago it was time to replace the whole lot because it was starting to creak, and so now there's a modern system there with, in some places, depending on fairway width and so on, 3 lines of sprinklers, enough coverage that you can keep everything you want to irrigate damp, but designed in such a way as you're not losing heather through overwatering it. It's been a natural evolution of the irrigation there, I think, over time. So I think there's we actually touched on water sources earlier, didn't we? And the likelihood that mains water will move away. Clubs are enlarging their reservoirs, boreholes, and but I think the technology side of things is getting more and more important. Most decent clubs have a full automated irrigation system, but the technology side of things is getting more intuitive all the time and more accurate. So linked to the weather stations, your modern system, like the one they installed at Woking, that will adjust your planned irrigation based on weather patterns that occur when you're not there as a course manager. You're at home in bed. I think a lot of the judgment will come out of that, and the technology will help remove some of that judgment from the course manager's multifaceted role. In terms of smart irrigation, I took that to mean this sort of technology, the interface between the system and the computer back at the shed or on the person's phone or iPad or whatever. But I think there's some money being spent on further developing that. I played at the Grove not long ago, and they have a tee where that is replenishing moisture from within the root zone, which is quite an interesting. I've been meaning to explore more what that was. I mean, it's a trial. I think I was told it's the first site in Europe trialing that, but they have a sensor adjacent to the tee which requires a bit of electricity, and they're doing that with solar, but that will be constantly monitoring the soil moisture of that teeing ground and replenishing as required from the root zone, rather than, it's enormously, I can't remember the number, but it's enormously wasteful in a way, irrigating from above, because you get spray drift. If there's any breeze, not all of your water's going to land where it is, and you can compensate for that by sending it out on a lower arc and so on, but you'll always lose some. It's not a terribly efficient process, whereas the thing they were trialing at the Grove sounds like it could be a very interesting development. Won't be cheap though, I wouldn't have thought.
No, I can't imagine. It's probably not quite as expensive as sub-air systems, but you never know. I guess I'm just minded to finish up this section by mentioning a program that is in play in Adelaide, actually, specifically in relation to Royal Adelaide and Kayunga, which would be in pretty close vicinity in Adelaide. People may not be aware, but South Australia is one of the driest places in Australia, and obviously water and access to water is much more of an issue there than it would perhaps be in these parts most of the time. The local authority has assisted both Kayunga and Royal Adelaide to basically pipe in wastewater from the airport and the surrounding suburbs into reed beds and wetland areas, which obviously they use for irrigation. They also have a borehole tap into the artesian water supply, or water basin, if you like. So essentially, with the purification that goes on through the reed beds and the wetland area, they actually pump water back into the artesian water supply as well, which obviously balances up what they take. I just thought that was a fascinating interplay between local government, the requirement for a golf course in terms of irrigation, and just from a sustainability perspective, that actually they're not just take. They're actually, they're balancing up the books in terms of an input like water.
Fascinating. I didn't know about that, but I'll be investigating that. I think it's there have been quite a lot of initiatives around sustainability, and water is a major part of that picture over the years. The Audubon scheme, Golf Course 2030, and geo-certification currently more and more being expected of clubs, and I think there'll be a knock on where in time members will be expecting their clubs to be performing, improving their sustainable nature, and I think that golf is doing a lot of things right in that picture, but there's certainly a way to go, and the fact that the RNA and other bodies are well behind that movement has got to help this sort of what they're doing at Royal Adelaide. They're a sort of bigger picture thinking around water is essential. There's all sorts of things you can do with harvesting of, you have some pretty hard surfaces around most golf clubs with car parks and roofs and so on. And I know when I went, it was quite a time ago, 2004, I first went to California and visited some clubs there, and that's a pretty dry landscape generally, and there's a bit of a shortage on mains water. Most of the clubs there were shut on a Monday, and they would flush grey water through their greens on a Monday. A very heavy application of water to replenish the moisture in those surfaces.
Is it Pasatiempo or the Meadow Club that has basically partnered with the local, whatever the town up the street and up the hill is, in terms of actually tapping into their grey water system?
Oh, I don't know, but when I went to Pasatiempo, and they were certainly one of the ones that were heavily reliant, but proactively reliant. I don't think they got to point where they were being forced to do it. It was a conscious environmental decision for them to use grey water for their irrigation. Gosh, Shane, I've got a whole list of things to explore now. I'm clearly out of touch,
mate. I'll put a link to the Royal Adelaide piece in the show notes. That is available directly off their website. Right. It's a fascinating exposition of what is sustainable and responsible, particularly in an area which is literally, it's right beside the desert, and when you fly in there, it's actually interesting to see. Desert, it then turns into the Barossa, which is the wine capital of South Australia, and it it literally turns brown to green, essentially down to the vagaries of the weather, and they can be in drought quite a lot of the time. So depending on sprinkles of rain out of the sky is a fool's errand if you're in South Australia. Maybe not so much this year with El Nino in evidence, but generally speaking. Maybe we can move on to a little bit of talk about course furniture, Richard. I obviously have added something in. I say car parks, I say that in jest, obviously referencing your particular article on car parks, which was an absolute triumph. Tony Deere, if you're listening, well done for all those suggestions about shoelaces and whatever else. But interested just to sort of get your feel for paths, signage, flags, pins and bunker rakes. And whether you're a minimalist sort of guy or if you're a maximalist sort of guy, what do you like in terms of course furniture? And obviously, Adrian Logue, if Logue is listening as well, we'll try and accentuate some of your paths talk as well.
Yeah, he's keen on paths and chess. You've probably got the hang of me by this point, I would think. Aesthetically, okay, let's go through them. So paths, I love grassed paths. We're all playing lots of golf. There are lots of golfers around. There's a real wear on grass, but if you can put in grass paths and put in a bit of irrigation to keep them healthy, make them a bit wider than you might ordinarily have. I think they're just wonderful. They've done a lot of this down at Royal Cinque Ports, and you can't hear people coming when they're on the path on the adjacent hole, because these gorgeous runoffs just sort of flow into the path to the next tee and off the other side. So I love that, but I appreciate not every site can do that. There's various other things you can use, and I've seen them used, but I don't really like any of them. They cost a fortune, some of them. So yeah, pretty rustic answer to that one. You're going to get a few of these rustic answers. Signage, as little as possible. I love taking photos of really properly rustic signs around the place. I like them to be wooden and just not too wordy, and if you get away without having signs there, just do it. And there's nothing worse than an enormous warning sign. And actually, from running a club for 5 years, I know full well that most people will just walk past. If there's too much signage around, they won't pay any attention to it. Stick it on the scorecard, stick it on the notice board in the clubhouse, but just keep the courses minimal as you can would be my preference. Flags, most clubs seem to use the same flags, or fairly generic flag sticks and so on. I did see some gorgeous ones. I don't know if they still use them, but at Bel Air Country Club in Los Angeles, and they were handmade, and the staff would carve these wooden treasures every winter and then paint them up, and they had the, obviously the club crest on the silks, which they'd rotate every now and then. But I love it when there's something a bit different about the course furniture, and handmade is better to me. Lots of clubs are taking down loads of trees. Well, if you've got a skilled person in there with a chainsaw, you might be able to create some quite interesting features out of, benches out of fallen tree trunks and T markers, and actually just recycling stuff rather than just relying on the local company that provides everyone else with identical kit. Bunker rakes, I've changed my answer on that one since you just recommended the whisk.
The whisk, yeah.
Anything
Excellent.
that's going to help them rake the bunker is a good thing to me. But having said that, if I was running a rustic 9-hole in my back garden, you wouldn't have any bunker rakes. You just try and not hit the ball in the bunker.
I was not surprised with all of those answers. You would certainly those answers would be hewn off the same block as my good self. I'm minded just to mention, I guess, first of all, in terms of the signage and something I came across in Barnbougle down in Tasmania, all of the signage is basically handmade from wood that was found on the property by one of the greenkeepers, I believe, originally. Another brand for people, and I guess I'm a real golf tragic to know some of this stuff. Cheeseborough Pins is a manufacturer from the USA, and I came across their wares in Australia at both Kingston Heath and Victoria. The flagpoles themselves actually are sort of semi-fiberglass with a grip that's actually made of hickory. Lovely, lovely solution. Obviously brass fittings, etc., etc. I'm assuming, Richard, you will be a fan of countersunk bins on tee boxes, that you actually have the functionality of a bin, but you can't see it. It's foot operated.
I haven't seen those. I've seen I saw bunker rakes like that in Pacific Grove, I think, in California, where there's this sort of like rectangular plastic thing. This years ago, they might have got rid of. You sort of press it, and now it pops a bunker rake. That was quite funny. But no, I haven't seen the countersunk bins. But the alternative, as you'll be guessing what I'm about to say, is maybe people could take away their litter with them in their golf bag.
Well, in the same way as maybe we could be a little bit more forgiving about Bellis perennis in the ground. In other words, daisies. At the end of the day, you play on grass or on daisies. It all rips up the same way.
Yeah.
It's an aesthetic, I suppose. And one final point, which I'm assuming you would not believe, the metal poles for signage have any business being anywhere near the first tee or indeed anywhere else on the golf course.
Yeah, you're right. Just as few of those as possible, I think. That's the one thing that's yeah. I'm not gonna. Hopefully, you're not gonna ask me about world handicapping system because I'll dodge that if I want to stay positive. But
I'll cross that particular question out. So
okay, the enormous white matrices that aging golf club members seem to be standing in front of, scratching their head. I mean, keep them in the clubhouse. they're just awful.
And you actually hit the nail on the head there. I'm actually referring to a particular metal pole with one of those matrices. I can actually visualize it now. I won't say where it is, but if anyone's listening, they'll probably understand where it is. Listen, I just want to touch upon the relationship between agronomy and greenkeeping and course architecture. The more I scramble around the bottom of this particular rabbit hole, the more I'm coming to the conclusion that amongst the great golf courses, there exists a sympathetic equilibrium and interplay between a course's design and the agronomic conditions that are presented. It's the sort of symbiosis where tended elements reinforce and complement the specific questions that the designer intended. I'm wondering, do you think that it's important for the superintendents and greens team to be out and out architecture nerds?
Well, I think it's helpful. In short, I think it is helpful, but we're not all architecture nerds. In fact, we're in the tiny minority, I think, in terms of the worldwide golfers. So, as a way to get around that and appreciate that there'll be many very capable professionals who aren't really interested in the architecture, I think the way the course is set up needs to be planned in such a way that stuff doesn't get missed. So that the mowing lines and so on are using the design to the best effect. They're enhancing the strategic appeal of the golf course. I've just said it, but not all of us care about this. Lots of people have different reasons to go and play golf, so they're not as far down the rabbit hole of architecture as some of us are. But I think you can diminish the strategic appeal of a golf hole quite easily if you don't understand how to present it. So I think the onus really is on the club there to, if necessary, consult with experts and involve in that, not just the sort of typical plan for development and so on, but just the day-to-day stuff where the architecture is perhaps not being used to its best effect, and making sure people understand that it's again education. So in the same way that if golfers were better educated about turf science, they don't need a lot of that, but if they had some understanding of how much work and science and artistry goes into presenting a golf course, and why the hole looks a certain way or why a certain bunker keeps catching their ball, that's got to be a good thing. If people understand, the more they understand, the better, I think. So I'm sorry, Shane, I'm struggling slightly with the question, but I think it's really important that someone at the club who's in a decision-making position has a good feel of the architecture, and it gets more and more important the more valuable and special a course's design is.
And I guess, what plays into that is consistency through time and a passing on of institutional knowledge in relation to that particular understanding.
Yeah, and I think that stuff's easier to pass on these days and record. Whether we do it or not is probably a different question. But there's, when you see a typical renovation project these days, you'd have aerial photos from probably 3 different decades through the last 100 years for, say, a colt course. and it can show where things have changed, and then you could get more granular and go through green minutes and so on, and find out exactly why and when and how. But with the technology we have at our disposal now, and the number of good, sensible architects that are around there, if a club wants to make the most of what it has in this period of being a custodian of hopefully a classic golf course, then they need a plan, and they need to be making sure that the people looking after the golf course understand the sort of strategy behind it.
Sure. Perhaps we can take a look at the future of greenkeeping. What do you think the future in greenkeeping and course presentation might look like? Again, how long is a piece of string, but what's your feel of how it's likely to evolve in terms of technology, in terms of global warming, in terms of an aesthetic or sustainability? What do you think?
I think it's going to get harder. I think it's been getting harder to present golf courses for many years now, and some of the people I know and speak to are saying the same thing. It's the climate is certainly getting more volatile. The availability of the tools that we're accustomed to using is getting harder and harder. The expectation of the golfer is going up. Just in a very recent development, the last 2 years, play on most of these courses, despite having had the rest of lockdown, play is up, and that has a knock-on effect on how easily you can present the course without being, having play right behind you. It affects compaction. It affects, the number of divots you're repairing or whatever. There is plenty of technology out there that's developing with golf courses. There's a lot of golf courses around, but it's still not that lucrative a market for technology. I think you'll find robotic mowers and ball collectors and so on. They're already out there in some places, and there'll be a further move towards using GPS in the way that modern agriculture does to spray with basically remote controlled tractors. So I think there'll be some advances in technology, but whether they are applicable to all bits of the golfing market or not, I doubt. I don't know. I think as golf courses have to become more sustainable environmentally, I think they will have to move towards a more rustic or basic presentation, move back towards that. And, every April we talk about the Augusta effect, and there's lots of good stuff for the industry worldwide that comes out of events like that, but there's also lots of stuff that's just nothing to do with the links courses of the west coast of Ireland or whatever. And I think we'll be forced down a position where many of the courses have to back off a little. And it ties into, I think, something else you're going to ask me about, which is staffing, because it really feels to me at the moment like the golf industry is, certainly in the UK, is struggling. Not as many people going through college, good people leaving the industry for various reasons, and there's a challenge there, I think, for greenkeepers. I mean, I did it for 5 years, greenkeeping, and I wouldn't rule out doing it again. It's a wonderful thing, being outside, turning around at the end of the day and seeing the fruits of your labor in the work that you've done out there. It's a satisfaction that most knowledge workers can only dream of. But it's a tough way to earn a living, and it's not getting any easier. So Sorry, Shane, it sounded like a fairly bleak picture I'm painting of the future. I'm sure golf will carry on going, but it's not going to be easy. And I think if we underestimate or take for granted the professional people that are running the golf courses, and all their breadth of knowledge and all their education that's got them to that point, then we're in danger of losing further good people from the game, which would be a shame.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting probably at this time to counterpoint the attitude amongst golfers in the United States to the turf profession versus perhaps the attitude that is exhibited, not exclusively, but perhaps in the main in Ireland and the UK, in that, and I must preface this by saying this isn't my belief, but certainly I understand that some people may consider the green staff the hired help versus the professional help, and see it as a menial task, and maybe not appreciate the education and the skills-based training and the travel that some of the green staff and the greens team have done throughout the world to further their knowledge and experience, and I guess to have a better understanding of how a golf facility is run from right the way through, from all of the things we were talking about.
You're spot on. And again, for the average club golfer, that's it's something where we could do better in terms of education. So I had the good fortune to spend some time with the chief executive of Bigger, which is the Greenkeepers Association over here recently. Incredibly bright and motivated guy, and cares deeply about golf and the industry and his members, the greenkeepers. And he was saying in the States, the typical superintendent in the States will have been through a bachelor's degree and probably a master's degree, and often be a doctor in a certain area of turf science. And there's a few of those over here. There's master's program at Cranfield. Lots of our head greenkeepers, course managers are well qualified in terms of MVQs or HNCs or whatever. But the thing that stood out for him was how many of the junior positions in golf clubs over here still have MVQ2 or MVQ3. They've been through the basic qualification programs, and the clubs put them through those, and yet we don't shout about that as much, and we don't tend to talk as much as we might, or celebrate as much as we might, how hard those people work, and just countless hours they put in, not just repairing other people's pitch marks, but we all wear most of us have tracking devices for steps and stuff these days. I can't tell you how many steps some of the team at Woking were doing for major event season. They were hand mowing greens and tees, and they would just, I'm surprised they could stand up at the end of the day, and then they're up at 4:30 again the following morning. So the whole golf industry has a challenge in terms of staffing, but I think for greenkeeping, that challenge has been there for a fair while. And if you were to look at the Bigger website for openings for greenkeepers in the southeast here, I can't remember the last time I looked, there was a dozen there, and they're all top golf clubs, and they're probably not paying enough that it makes sense for those people to do the job despite their qualifications, despite it being a in theory great working environment. They can go out and earn more delivering parcels. So it's a tricky, it feels like a crossroads for the industry, really.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when you're trying to compete with Amazon and their distribution centers, fair enough, you're outside. But I think the crux of that particular point is, I certainly believe that green staff and superintendents are underpaid and underappreciated, and it's just down to a lack of, I guess, people really seeing as Adrian Logue says, actually, it's eyes up versus eyes down. If you're more focused on what the greens and tees look like and the bunker presentation and what your score is, you're not actually going to see the work in terms of the whole site, what the guys do, and even in terms of an understanding what a winter program, the breadth of a winter program. And I mean, you're not going to see a huge amount of growth during the winter, but if you open your eyes, you can actually see the boys doing X, Y, and Z, and they're very, very focused on delivering the winter program, and I guess what I'm saying really is there's a lot of difference between your front lawn and preparing a sports turf surface.
Yeah. The worlds apart. I know we've dodged talking about committees and so on, but if there was one thing that came out of that, it's just hire good people and let them get on with it. I mean, that's the message that most other industry leaders, I mean, in other industries, rely on. Recruitment and talent is key, and then just give them a plan and let them get on with it. And if golf did that as a whole, I think it'd be in a fairly different position.
I would like to echo those sentiments and say a hearty hear on that particular point. Look, we're getting into the final few questions. I'd like you to consider your bucket list in terms of golfing. I know you've travelled widely and played quite a lot of places of late, so I can imagine that a lot of the courses that may have been on your bucket list, be those revisited bucket listers or indeed first time bucket listers, that those obviously if you've played the courses, I'd like you to sort of discount those. But what 5 courses in your mind are at the top of your bucket list at the moment?
Okay. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've been knocking off a few of these recently. So, Cleve Hill was fabulous, and Muirfield, after all those years of waiting, having watched Fowler win there in '87, I went there and played it in under an hour, speed golfing, which was great fun. But anyway, so I've ticked off a few. So I'm ashamed to admit this is the question I spent the most time thinking about, Shane, in advance.
That's allowed, no problem. But daydreaming is appreciated and, in fact, encouraged.
Ah, good. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this bit of prep. So I thought, well, how am I going to choose? So I pulled up the 147, what does he call them? Rands flavors of golf, which is just
custodians of the game.
Custodians of the game. It's just fabulous. And then I had various.
I'm going to have to put a link into the show notes on that. Just to clarify, people, that's on golfclubatlas.com. Ran Morissette, who is the doyen of golf course architecture and ratings, actually head of the ratings panel for golf.com or Golf Magazine. I'll put a link into that as well.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, in case Rand's listening to this, that website and the friends I made on there when I was a greenkeeper back in the early 2000s, they were transformational experiences in terms of getting the architecture bug and doing the greenkeeping and then moving indoors and so on. So anyway, I went through that list and there were a few on there that I thought about. I thought about having various criteria, like one in each country or one per architect or whatever. I was going round and round in circles.
Just to interrupt you there, the obviously the it can be on your bucket list, but it has to be realistic. Okay, so just if you've any of those unrealistic American places in there, please put a bloody line through them right now. I'm only joking.
Well, I'm gonna have to count up here. Actually, I had so many on the list. So I got one. That has to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so I'm going to rule out a couple of those American places.
Okay, so, go
on. Chicago Golf Club, always fancied
Beautiful.
that.
Okay.
But that didn't make the list. Ballybunion, never been down there. Royal Wellington.
We can sort Ballybunion out pretty
there we go. Yeah. So that's the return leg of the Addington Challenge, is it?
Well, there you go. Absolutely.
Royal Wellington, the Sacred Nine, never played that. Just heard so much about it, and I've actually driven past it half a dozen times. So it's just every time I see it mentioned anywhere, that hurts. Prestwick in Scotland. I know a lot of people who get the Prestwick vibe, and I'm not a big drinker these days, but I think I could probably stretch through a few
quaff a bit of Kimmel.
Don't they take a percentage of the UK's Kimmel supply? I think up there.
I believe it's becoming more difficult to get a hold of. The importer has maybe stopped importing, or maybe people, because of, well, don't say it, Brexit, have stopped exporting it.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a wonderful. You should link to the cookie jar thing on that I'm sure you'll have read that, will you? Have you?
Sorry, cookie jar. I've no
Cookie
idea.
jar
What, no,
golf.
no idea what that is.
I'll
That's a
send it
joke,
to you. You
obviously.
have to put it in the show notes. So okay, I'm going to rule out an American place because you told me I had to. So national golf
No,
links.
you don't. You go on. You don't have to. No, an MGLA deserves to be on that list.
Well, I think it's been edged out, so I'll come to that. So that was number 5. Montfontaine in France. I love Simpson. I worked in New Zealand down the road where Simpson renovated heavily in the late 20s, and just the simplicity of his design is just fabulous. I've been to, he was heavily influenced by Woking as well, so that plays in. He's had a role in various clubs around here, including Woking, who he rebuilt the 9th and 10th for, and they got changed again subsequently. So there's a story there that I'll try and spread at some point. So Montfontaine.
A rumor or a story?
A story.
Oh, that's okay.
Askanish, bit of old Tom, and by this point in the conversation you get why I would love to get up there. It's just traditional golf, rustic, fitting in with the surroundings, everything done on a minimal sort of budget, and just a wonderful story there. So I'd love to get up there. It's a bit of a schlep to get there, but on a similar line, one that I've only become aware of quite recently, and I've got a book waiting to read about it, Sweetens Cove. Been featured on a couple of podcasts recently. I just think that sounds like the most incredibly back to basics golf experience. You mentioned St. Patrick's earlier, and so I've played Sand Hills, Coral Crenshaw, I've played Tillinghast at San Francisco, but I've played some great golf courses here and abroad. I've not played a Tom Doak course, and got a lot of respect for him.
You've missed out.
I know, and there's just each one that you see looks fantastic, but I also like his communication style. He writes beautifully, and he's not afraid to speak up for what he feels is important. We will look back on this era as maybe the platinum age of golf architecture, because you've got the likes of Coral Crenshaw and Doak and Clayton and too many others to mention. I don't want to miss anyone out, but there's a lot of momentum behind traditional strategic design at the moment, and it's just we're lucky to be in this era, I think, absorbing it and being able to see it happen. So the pictures that are coming across the ocean from Tree Farm in the States and 7 Mile Beach, it's just, we're getting to see this stuff unfold in real time. It's a blessing, I think. So I think that's 4. It's 5 if I include national golf links, but I'm going to rule that out. You might have to do some editing on this bit, Shane, because I could go on for hours about this bucket listing.
That's okay.
Here's one. So
it's a very loose 5, Richard.
Okay.
You want to quote 10 at me? That's fine too.
I think I'm beyond that already. But so there's a place. My parents lived in Broadstairs in Kent, about 10 miles from Royal St George's and Prince's and Royal Cinque Ports, and there's a local course there called North Foreland, which I've actually never played because I took up golf after the first time they moved away. But there's a short course there called the North Cliff, which I have played when I was about 8 or 9 on a day trip back after we'd moved away. Long story. But I gather that's designed by Fowler and Simpson, and a couple of friends I know on the Kent coast just absolutely love it there. So I'm trying to manipulate a way of going down there and having a day's foursomes.
Is there a shed down there that needs to be cleaned, Richard?
Well, I've got to finish cleaning mine first, but yeah, no, I'll offer to clean the guy's shed maybe while listening to this. So I think just in terms of my entry into golf, playing on a rugged pitch and putt over the park in Cardiff, Heath Park in Cardiff, for anyone who's at that part of the world, just I still hark back to that, even having played at Muirfield, blah blah blah. Just having 3 balls and a club, and just being the pure game of knocking a ball around on a pretty rustic site. I think North Cliff at North Foreland really appeals to me on that. So I'm gonna bump NGLA off, and that means I'll probably never get there. But
That's probably the first time North Foreland has ever bumped NGLA anywhere.
yes, yeah. So I can carry on dreaming about NGLA, but I've got no chance of going there now. So, but I just think that and Sweetens Cove and Askanish, they all appeal to my sort of sensibility. So I'll go with those.
Excellent,
That
excellent.
was
Well, I
about
think
half an hour, that section, wasn't it? I'm sorry.
that's fine. It's okay. It's all right. No problem at all. No problem. It's, as I said to you earlier on. It's all about you. It's all about you. It's. I'm just here to facilitate and prod and poke you in the right direction or the wrong direction, as the case may be. Obviously, having read your blog pieces on at Pitchmarks, I know you appear to be very extremely well read, and this is the point where I ask my guest to recommend 2 golf books that our listeners just must read. They can entertain, they can befuddle, they can do most anything. But what would you say the 2 books that you would most recommend if the listeners have not read them already? But what would you recommend?
Okay, I spent ages thinking about this one too, but by that point my brain was hurting from the bucket list question. So if anyone's read the Pitchmark stuff, Alistair Cook's The Marvelous Mania is not going to surprise anyone. He was the voice of part of my childhood on Sunday mornings, doing Letter from America. He was just a late comer to golf at 55, but The Marvelous Mania is just a collection of essays and reviews. He does a review of Bobby Jones's book and a review of the World Match Play at Wentworth. And they're just glorious, wry looks at golf and sort of self-deprecating in a way. He was never a good player, but from 55 until I think he was 94 when he died, he was out there at San Francisco and Olympic with his mates, and he traveled the world and watched the president's putter and stuff. There's just so much good stuff in there. So that's my first one. It won't surprise you, I would have thought, because I keep on banging on about him, but I haven't found anyone, including Darwin, who writes in a manner about golf that I enjoy as much as Alistair Cook. So I just wish there was more of that. And then the second one, so that one's really an entertainment job. The second one goes back to the sort of themes of education and committee involvement that we managed to quite nicely dodge. And the point I made about not having been to St. Patrick's or any other of Tom Doak's courses, I had an Anatomy of the Golf Course by Tom Doak. I don't know, probably 15 years ago. I'm not sure it was a long time ago anyway, and I don't know how many times I've read it, but I never tire of it. It's just a window into the mind of an artist, and he's, it goes beyond the just the mechanics of how to build a golf with good drainage and a coherent routing. And I know he's done more work since that I probably need to catch up on, but I just thought if anyone looks to be involved in a golf course or club, or they want to learn more about this daft game, that should be their starting point. It's fabulous to read. He writes incredibly well, and it's just educationally, it just keeps giving. So there we go. Doak and Cook.
Brilliant, brilliant. I mean, I just, with reference to Anatomy of a Golf Course, I have had that book for the last two odd years, and I've read it 3 times already. But I have always thought that it gives the reader a view into or at the soul of golf, in terms of all its idiosyncrasies and the human process that goes on in terms of actually playing golf. He is some writer, and he's not afraid to tell you what he thinks. Agree with him or not, he doesn't really care. He's somebody that speaks his mind, and probably has over the years tempered his presentation a little bit. Obviously the first editions of the Confidential Guide were pretty direct, I suppose, is probably the best way to do it, and I guess historically back then in the mid 80s, sort of early 90s, the golf press was very hail fellow, well met, don't have a go at anybody because we're all chums. And Tom's not like that.
No.
Tom just gives it between the eyes, and that's very much the sort of person I am. So I kind of see myself in the way Tom presents his thoughts. You're not wondering what Tom's thinking because it's coming out of his mouth.
Yeah. Actually, you said there was some flexibility on the bucket list, and you said it's a fluid 5. I'm going to stick a third in the golf books, but it's another Doak book, actually, and it's one that Bob Crosby, who I had the pleasure of hosting Bob and Betsy at New Zealand once, and then they came to Woking again a couple of years back, pre-COVID. But he was kind enough to send me the book in your hand. There we are. Tom Doak's, what is it called? Little Red Book of Golf Course Architecture.
Yeah, a little take on Harvey Pinnock's Little Red Book, but just as entertaining and just as forthright and as educational.
And I didn't realise until it arrived and I started reading it not that long ago that it's basically Tom's Golf Club Atlas contributions from years ago that would have just been lost in the ether. And so you get a bit more of that frankness in there, and it's just someone, with an incredibly deep knowledge and love for this artistry that's architecture that sort of most golfers just drift past with their trolley and their scorecard, and he's these people are gifted, passionate artists, and it just sums it up beautifully, I think.
And look, the wonderful thing obviously through Golf Club Atlas is that he's a regular contributor, and you may not be in the inner sanctum in terms of posting stuff, but you can be a bit of a you can look in from the outside in terms of their discussion group, and he does post very, very regularly on all manner of stuff. So it's great to have that window into his thoughts on an ongoing basis on projects that he's working on and any other topics that he cares to muse on.
Yeah, it's a gift. We're lucky.
Very lucky, very lucky. But look, in conclusion, Richard, you might just let listeners know where they can find you online, should they want to catch up on your writings or just to say hello.
Yeah, so I am, for anyone who's in the dark world of Twitter, my handle on there is @pitchmarks, which sort of ties in with my ranting about people repairing their own pitch marks earlier. And just bear with me while I find out. So I'm sending out a bit of fun, really, but a golfing newsletter, and it varies from reviews to a bit of agronomy to anything else that comes out, really. That is richardpennell.substack.com. And I link to those through the Twitter handle from time to time. So there we are. Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure to have you on this episode of the Firm and Fast Golf podcast. Thank you for assisting me in shining a light on the very mysterious world of agronomy and greenkeeping. I hope you might consider coming back on at some point. In the meantime, keep it between the ditches and happy golfing.
Thank you very much, Shane. Really enjoyed it.
More than welcome, mate. Cheers.
Cheers.
As I mentioned in the introduction, it is my intention that this episode will act as a stepping off point into the world of agronomy. I'm aiming to speak to turf professionals located in Ireland, the UK and farther afield. I hope you leave this particular listen just a little more knowledgeable than may have been the case previously. I can assure you I certainly have. Just a little reminder that you can find us online at firmandfast.golf and on Twitter at firmandfastgolf. Please subscribe, share and comment. It really is appreciated. Until the next time, happy golfing.